it is such a vile thing, a violent thing, that's why the sentencing, if you are convicted of mutiny, is death. So what he's saying is, like you said, here these men are refusing to get into the truck because of the weather. Refusing to get in the truck constitutes mutiny. No, I don't think so.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. In honor of the 80th anniversary of the completion of the Alaska-Canada Highway, we talk with author Christine McClure, who with her late husband Dennis wrote 2 books about the construction of the Alcan. The first, We Fought the Road, was a more general history of the 3 black regiments that were instrumental in the building of that 1,600-mile road in just 8 months. Today we explore their second book, A Different Race, which tells a very specific story. The winter of 1943 was historically cold in interior Alaska. Soldiers of the 97th Regiment were not provided with proper clothing, and when a group of them were ordered into the back of a truck for a 130-mile trip to Fairbanks when it was 34 degrees below zero, they refused. They were court-martialed and brought up on charges of mutiny, a crime punishable by death. 9 of the 10 soldiers were found guilty.
Christine McClure, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's so great to have you back again as we are on the cusp of celebrating the 80th anniversary of the, quote, completion of the Alcan Highway. Of course, you know as well as I do that exactly 80 years ago when they, quote, completed it, it was actually not a passable road.
Correct.
For most vehicles.
Yes.
And I guess to get started, for people who may not have listened to our first interview, can you tell us a little bit about you and your husband Dennis's first book on the Alcan called We Fought the Road and how that book came about?
I found my father's letters and pictures and realized that he was building the Alaska Highway and that he was also a member of the 93rd Black Engineer Troops. So my husband and I decided to make a trip to Alaska and essentially look for where his regiment and where he moved and location. And as we traveled the Alaska Highway, we soon learned that there were 3 black regiments, and the story about those black regiments had not been told. So the first book is about my father's 93rd Black Regiment, and the new book.
Right, and just to be clear, your father was actually not black; he was white.
Correct.
And explain a little bit about how that worked.
He was a white officer, and he was a regimental transportation officer of the 93rd Regiment. And usually these black regiments, you had 1,200 black soldiers, and then you had mixed in with that about 30, 40 white officers and non-commissioned officers. So.
Right. And so just for our listeners, We Fought the Road is a wonderful book. It's very, very informative and interesting and important. But the new book, or, the relatively newer book that we're talking about today is A Different Race. And Can you talk about how that book came about, how you knew that there was a second book, through your research on We Fought the Road?
When we went up to the highway to do marketing with We Fought the Road, we decided to go to Valdez and give a presentation at the library there. And the more people we talked to and kept telling us that there were soldiers that were in chains in the stockade, and a court martial occurred where they charged them for mutiny. And we had a difficult time finding information about that. And so we knew that was going to be a good book. And we got the 400-page court-martial transcript from St. Louis, and it proved yes. And we started with searching for the 10 men. But that's how we got that information. Everybody was saying, yes, they had these 10 men. Matter of fact, sometimes it was 15 or 20, but that were court-martialed for mutiny. And Dennis and I couldn't understand that because this was a project. This wasn't combat. So I have...
Right.
Okay.
Well, I want to talk about the details of that case, which you illustrate very well in the second half of the book. The first half of the book is really about the 97th Regiment, their assignment on the Alcan. And so can you talk a little bit about what the 97th Regiment was tasked with?
The 97th Regiment was the only black regiment that did not have a white engineering regiment, either ahead of them or following them. And so they were given the task to go into Valdez and get across Thompson Pass all the way to Gulkana and then follow the Abercrombie Trail to what is known today as Tok. But behind the scenes, Sturtevant and his generals said, we can't let the blacks intermingle with the civilians, let alone the First Nations in that area. So they sent a Public Road Administration, Lytle and Green, which are civilian contractors, and it took them a very long time to get organized. And they finally arrived at Valdez Dock in July. The black soldiers were already building the road because they arrived in April. But the point being, the black soldiers were supposed to be following Lytle and Green. That did not happen. Lytle and Green instead followed them. And Lytle and Green went all the way up the Richardson Highway to Delta and started their road process. And then some of the civilians also from Gulkana, because that's where their main base was, followed the 97th over Mentasta Pass to Tok. So my husband and I said, well, why in the world would they even send black troops up there to make the road? Because that was, as you mentioned, it was a waste of time to even make a road from Gulkana to Tok. It was
right. Well, I want to talk about that.
Out of the way. Yes.
So people who are listening who are in Alaska, we know that there is the main highway, the Richardson Highway, runs from Valdez to Delta Junction and then on to Fairbanks.
Correct.
So what was happening that just seems so absurd and is such a frustrating part of the book is that, the 97th Regiment, because the leadership in the Army wanted to keep the black troops separate from white civilians, they wanted this really incredibly difficult road built between Gulkana and Tok through Slana. And it is, I think you'll talk, if you could talk a little bit about this. These guys didn't know how to build a road when they arrived in Alaska. A lot of them had minimal training in these skills. So they were being asked to do this, in the most difficult of conditions in a place that they'd never been before and not following the main highway that made the most sense.
Correct. Because the Alaska Highway from Whitehorse north towards Delta was being built by the 18th Regiment. And then the civilians started from Delta south toward
Whitehorse.
Yes. So that portion of the road had not been built. But yes, the 97th started building road from Slana. There was a path from Gulkana to Slana, but from Slana all the way to Tok was essentially they had to find Abercrombie's Trail, which is 1900 that happened. So that was very, very difficult. And once they attacked the sand hills around Slana River, and when you drive this, you can see the sand, and they had to drive their bulldozers over the sand, and instead of going forward, the bulldozers moved sideways, and sometimes the track would fall off, and then they would have to put the track back on. But the most difficult part was over the moraine of that glacier, and to Clearwater Creek, all the way through to there. But that was a very difficult portion of the road. Carol Neely is the daughter of China's Roadhouse, Mr. Neely, who owned that, and he made the comment that it was just pure, and pardon my French, pure hell for these black soldiers to make this road, the Tope Cutoff Road, which everybody knows as today. So he remembered and told her stories of the blacks that were making this road.
In that context of knowing that the 97th Regiment, those troops had become quite skilled at what they were doing, and then you had these contractors falling in behind, and a lot of them were, like you said, recently hired. Maybe they had experience with roads, but maybe not building them in this particular part of the world. And I want to talk about, just compare their pay.
The privates were paid $21 a month, and of course, officers were paid more. But most of the contractors, the truckers were getting $25 to $30 a ton for a 200-mile haul, and drivers were getting $400 to $700 a month. That's a lot of money in 1942.
Yeah. Oh my God.
A cafe worker makes more than the privates. So all these people were making all this money, and which the government was paying for. Our government was paying for.
There's thousands of troops here, and there's thousands of contractors. There's a lot of people working on the road, and people got sick, and some people died. And there was on page 73, you talked about a black soldier who was sick and got, sent to Valdez, but ultimately didn't make it. And his captain,
he never made it. Yeah. He never made it on the road. He never lifted a shovel. His name was Major Banks, and he was from Virginia. And during that time, all of the soldiers were given the yellow fever shot, but many times the medical people didn't change the needles, and there was also the vaccine was contaminated, and a lot of soldiers suffered from a serum hepatitis. Well, Banks got the serum hepatitis. He died from liver failure. And when Captain Parsons, a white officer, after serving time down in Seattle, getting all the equipment up there to Valdez, he was charged by Colonel Whipple, please take care of this soldier who just passed away. So that's when he was, they got a coffin, and he did all the, the military protocol for death.
The citizens of Valdez objected.
Absolutely. Yes, they did.
They did not want a black man in their cemetery.
And there are
so go ahead and explain what was the problem. How did they solve the problem of Valdez refusing to allow a black man to be buried in the cemetery? They moved the
area across a river on the other side, and there were 4 lots, and he was buried. Major Banks was buried in one of those lots. So.
Yeah, I just found that interesting. I don't know if people of Valdez realize that they refused to have a black soldier buried in their cemetery. So you mentioned it, that the 97th Regiment really were heroes because the 18th had got hung up at the river and couldn't, do their portion. And so the 97th had to pick up the pace and construct a lot of extra road to actually meet up. And ultimately, towards the end of October, the bulldozers met each other. And then there, from the administrator standpoint, they had, quote, completed the road.
Yes. But they hadn't really.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
How can I lead into this? The 18th got stuck at the White River. They couldn't move their equipment. They sent Colonel Bridges and a small group of men to go across the permafrost. So everybody was praying for cold weather so they could drive their equipment. And they met the 97th up there. The 97th had already gotten to their end at the border. And all of a sudden they were told, now you have to help the white regiment, the 18th Regiment, so you can connect the road. So they had to build 55 more miles down to the 18th Regiment. So because of that, and Colonel Robinson, who was now the commander of the 97th, was promised that the 18th would provide Quonset huts and winter quarters for the 97th. That didn't happen. So all these soldiers along the road from Beaver Creek and up north, Northway to the Tok area, and then all the way up, halfway up to Fairbanks, they had spread this regiment out, and these soldiers had to live in tents.
And I also just want to mention for our listeners that this was coming on November 1942.
Yes.
And the winter between the winter of 1942, 1943 is a historically cold winter. There were multiple low temperature records set. Minus 60 degrees below zero, minus 70. Like, it was very, very cold.
Yes.
And these guys were sleeping in tents, and they did not have winter weather clothes.
Oh, no. They had to share parkas. They had to share their sleeping bags. Of course, they had wood stoves inside these barracks buildings that were just made of wood. They didn't have any black sheathings or the roofing wasn't fixed or anything like that. It was so cold that the officers moved from their tents down to a supply area.
A root cellar.
Root cellar. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And in there, and it was still cold, but none of them had the clothing at all. And Mary Hansen, who owned a roadhouse along that stretch of the road, and her husband, they made some gift packs of toothpaste and food and things like that. And when she and her husband brought these to the men, she noticed that the clothing, yes, she noticed that their clothing had holes in it. She saw bare skin. And and so they tried to help these soldiers that were around Delta, and they were in tents. So this is the worst weather ever for these men.
Right. I guess I think what I want our listeners to understand is just the way the military actually taught white soldiers to think about African Americans. And there's a couple of parts in the book. Oh, you know what's a really good one? And we didn't talk about this in advance, but on page 151, you have, there's a book called The Employment of Negro Troops by Ulysses Lee. And this was taught to officers at the U.S. Army War College.
Yes.
And can you read that paragraph that's from that manual?
It says, as an individual, the Negro is docile, tractable, lighthearted, carefree, and good-natured. If unjustly treated, he is likely to become surly and stubborn, though this is usually a temporary phase. He is careless, shiftless, irresponsible, and secretive. He resents censure and is best handled with praise and by ridicule. He is unmoral, untruthful, and his sense of right doing is relatively inferior. Crimes and convictions involving moral turpitude are nearly 5 to 1 as compared to convictions of white or similar charges.
There were real consequences to that, where you talked about in Europe how 83% of the men executed in Europe, in North Africa and the Mediterranean theaters of operation were African Americans, even though only 8.5% of the army was black. So,
that was court-martial, the court-martial execution.
Yes, the court-martial executions.
Yes.
83% of court-martial executions were of black men, even though they were a small minority of the actual army. That is foreshadowing for what we're about to learn about, which is the mutiny case against 10 of these black soldiers in the 97th Regiment. So can you talk about Well, and so we've laid the foundation. It is one of the coldest winters on record. They have poor clothes. They're having to sleep in tents. So I guess they have new command. They have new officers in charge who are not familiar with the culture of this unit. And I guess what happened?
Captain Howell was now in charge of the H&S Company, and they were located at Big Gurso River. They asked for help, a detachment of soldiers. So Captain Parsons let him have Sergeant Hurd and his 9 guys, excuse me. So they got in a truck and they traveled all the way to Big Gurso, and they started working for the development of a regional supply office in Fairbanks. So on March 29th, the temperature outside was 34 degrees below zero. And these soldiers were now loading.
Which, by the way, was a record low temperature. Record low temperature for March 29th.
Now, and Delta also had a record low temperature during that time. And we verified this with climatology experts in Alaska, that the whole Tanana Valley had the coldest winter that year. So these soldiers were there. The job was to load 4 deuce-and-a-half trucks. There were a couple cooks that were supposed to go with them, and with the supplies necessary to travel to Fairbanks, 130 miles away, to set up a regional or regimental supply office. So Captain Howell is now the head of H&S Company, and enter Sergeant Robert Lyon, who is a young officer, hasn't been in the Army very long, and Howell put him in charge of getting this group together and getting this job done. So as these men are working to load these trucks, they notice the condition of the trucks. Most of them, I think one of them had a cover. Most of them had tattered covers. There was snow and ice on the bottom back of the trucks, and things were being loaded. And the cooks are going to be riding in the heated portion up in the seats of the truck, and so is Lyons. So as they are doing this, the temperature is 34 degrees below zero. There is a first sergeant named Noah Williams, who tells these men, "You're nuts to go on this trip." And their clothes did not allow them to be prepared to travel 130 miles. Even at 20, 30 miles an hour, the chill factor would kill them. So
I know, and I want to point that out, that on page, we skipped over that. I told you I wanted to mention it. On page 129, that was with Bradford Washburn, the inspector who went to Alaska to inspect the clothing of the soldiers in the field. And I think just reading his report would actually be useful. If you want to just read the quote or explain who he was and why he was there and what his report was about.
The Army hired him. He was a mountain climber, an expert in cold weather gear. And they hired him to evaluate the clothing and the gear on the 97th because they kept getting complaints. So here is what he did in January 1943. A thorough survey was made of clothing and equipment of the 97th Engineers between Fairbanks and Northway. Temps down to 63 degrees below zero were encountered in the field, and clothing of this unit was found to be in abominable condition, so much so that the specimens of it were brought to Washington, D.C. to illustrate the extremes under which the American troops are operating in the field when their supply has been neglected. And even, he said that they're just hibernating, living hibernation.
Yeah, because they can't do anything. They can't leave their tent.
No. Yeah. Yes. Okay,
so I think like that. So they have these kinds of clothes, and this new lieutenant is saying, "You guys are going to ride in the back of this truck, this unheated truck, for 139 miles." Or however many miles it was. It was a long way. They were going to be in the back of the truck. 130
miles, yes. And that's all that Sergeant Hurd and his group knew about this trip. So Hurd was very concerned about his men. I mean, he's their boss, if you will. So he goes into the office of Howe and literally asks him, "Could we get a better conveyance? Can we get a better truck that has a cover for that?" And he said no, and said some nasty little comments. In other words, you got to put your big boy pants on. Let's get in the truck and get this done. So the men, and especially Private Sims Bridges, I'm not going. I don't want to go. I don't want to die, because they knew what would happen. And so it was a series of events where Howe had called the men into the orderly room and asked each one, are they going to go? Some said yes, some said no. And then the men went outside, milled around. I don't know, this is not a good idea. Then all of a sudden, Howe goes outside, looks at his watch, says, "I'll give you 10 seconds to get in the truck, or get behind me and get in the truck."
But you know what? I'm just going to interrupt, because First Sergeant Williams, had, who is a black man, told them not to get in the back of that truck. So there was kind of this. He was the first sergeant. I mean, he's super important. For people who don't understand, you in the military, you do what your first sergeant tells you.
Absolutely. And Williams has been with H&S Company for a very, very long time, and Howe was just the new commander, and he did not know him very well. So, but he warned these 10 men that there was a ruling made by Whitehorse that you are not supposed to work or go outside, and if the temperature is below
zero. Can we go to page 159? That first full paragraph that starts with Hurd and his soldiers. I think that's an important paragraph to kind of understand. I mean, these are African-American men raised in the South in the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
There's a culture. Like, what they're doing is, they really are concerned for their lives.
Hurd and his soldiers had understood since childhood that black men don't argue with white men. The Army had trained them that enlisted black soldiers don't argue with white officers, even white officers barely out of their knee pants. But disaster loomed in the back of that deuce and a half. Experience had trained them not to just lie down in the path of disaster.
Right. So, I mean, they know that they are doing something astronomically outside of the expected behavior.
Well, they also know because they took a truck from Northway to Delta, and it was warmer during that time. They were very familiar how long that trip was, and they were in the back of a deuce and a half, and it was cold. So what is going to happen when they get in those trucks and go 130 miles to Fairbanks at minus 34 degrees? Even if you go at 5 miles an hour, the chill factor is just going to kill you. It will. Right.
Okay. So he comes outside. He comes outside and says they have 10 seconds to get in the back of the truck.
Yes. And Hal is paying attention to his watch, and he doesn't see some of the movement of the men. And he counts out the 10 seconds, and then he starts heading toward Major Doyle, who was taking the place or is in charge of the H&S Company at this time, and complained to him that they were not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But what he didn't realize that 4 of the men had climbed in the back of the truck at that time. So, and then he comes back. He tells Williams, get these men off the truck and put them in the barracks under arrest. And that's when,
because he wants to make an example. I think we kind of forgot to say that the new leadership that came in was they were looking for a way to set an example to kind of reinforce discipline within that regiment, to say, like, this is what happens if you don't follow the correct protocol. When Howell comes out to talk to them and delivers his little speech, he calls it mutiny. And I think that's the thing that's so, like, this wasn't, these guys are refusing to obey an order to get into the back of a pickup truck, or essentially a bigger truck, I guess. and he makes it clear that they're committing mutiny and that mutineers are put to death.
It is so ludicrous because mutiny is when someone disobeys an order, okay? And it is such a vile thing, a violent thing, that's why the sentencing, if you are convicted of mutiny, is death. So what he's saying is, like you said, here these men are refusing to get into the truck because of the weather. Refusing to get in the truck constitutes mutiny. No, I don't think so. It constitutes a discipline problem, but not.
Right. It's and as I pointed out earlier, their first sergeant had told them not to do it.
Right.
So, but I think, really they're faced with an impossible dilemma. Do they get in the back of the truck and freeze to death, or do they not get in the back of the truck and face the death sentence? Face a death sentence from this lieutenant.
Yes, this lieutenant also, when he came away from Jack Doyle and told Williams to get him off the truck, all of the men were in the truck by that time.
Right, they'd all gotten in. That's true. So I guess So we know what's happened. So they decided they're going to make an example of these men. So what happens to them? They obviously do not get driven to Fairbanks. Mm-hmm. They are taken back. They're as you described at the very beginning, they end up in shackles.
They are taken to Whitehorse and put in a stockade, and the stockade commander was very upset because all these men had all this horrible clothing on, and out of his stores he had to clothe these men properly. Mm-hmm. But that's basically when they get taken as prisoners, then they finally get warmer clothing. Yes. Yes. So to talk about the court-martial is a very difficult topic because there's so many continuities or innuendos or hidden things and manipulation with this 3-day trial. But the important thing that needs to be mentioned, back then, they had an attorney, and then Captain Parsons was chosen by the men to represent them in this trial. But court-martials during this time were used as an instrument of command. Mm-hmm. And O'Connor knew this, Mitchum knew this. This is how they were going to get the black men into to behave, by using this
and I think you did a good job of explaining this in the book. And I think for our listeners who are in the military now, who understand how the military works now, this is prior to UCMJ. There is not a legal code. And really, the court-martial is to reinforce command. It is to reinforce discipline. Yes. It is not about getting justice. And I want to point out, you just said Captain Parsons would be their defense. Captain Parsons is not a lawyer. Captain Parsons is an engineer. He knows them. He knows these guys, and he loves them, and he wants to help them.
Yes. Yes.
But he doesn't know how.
Oh, and they shut him down several times during the questioning, and their stories change. And it's just, it would take us 3 hours to discuss the
I know. So,
and I have to say this. It was so difficult to write because the transcript of this court-martial was 400 pages long.
Holy cow.
So what do you put in to describe how they minimalized or compartmentalized Captain Parsons, how they shut him down when he tried to introduce proof, not only of the temperature and proof of the lack of equipment and proof of the lack of clothing, and this was a discipline problem, and supporting
and they kept telling him that it was irrelevant. They kept saying it was irrelevant.
Exactly. And then beefing up Howell's testimony by the next day, well, we were supposed to stop a couple times, or I told the men
adding new information
to wear their sleeping bags, put their sleeping bags on in the back of the truck. Really?
When they were never told to bring their sleeping bags to wear in the back of the truck.
Well,
you did a good job.
Howell and Lyons made a list of the clothing they had, and many of them didn't even have a sleeping bag or a parka or shoes.
Right.
It's just ridiculous. But the president of the group, Whitney, the jury, if you will, they all knew that this is what O'Connor wanted, as a incident where command can be reinstituted, and they kept shutting Parsons down.
Right.
So, but anyway.
And he wrote about it. It was very moving when, I think he was writing to a friend about what his, that he couldn't sleep because he was living and breathing this case, and he was doing everything he could.
That was his wife, Abby. He wrote to his wife.
Oh.
He just couldn't. Unbelievable. And his ending speech, they each have any speech talking about these men, and they depend on the white men. They don't have the education. They depend on us, to help them through. These men are a different race. So that's the title of this book. But it also refers to the race that these black men did, the extra 55 miles to close the highway. So it has a double meaning. But it was interesting that Parsons said these men are of a different race. He brought it up. Yes, he did. He brought it up, and of course, he was told that was completely irrelevant. Yes, and so Starr is the judge. Is that like the correct term? Yeah. So I just want, if you go to page 203, if you could read that quote from the judge. Yeah, he was the prosecutor. So, the prosecutor, Starr rose to deliver the closing arguments for the prosecution to begin the drama to its climax. During the last 3 days, he pontificated the court, quote, has been trying men for a crime seldom known, trying men for a deed most dastardly than that at Pearl Harbor. Most dastardly because every man who participated in this crime is a citizen of our own country. Mutiny. Yeah, it's and he goes on. He says the crime which these men committed strikes at the very foundation of our government. A crime that can be committed only by those, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's basically going. I mean, he wants full court press these men to be shot. Possible to be shot. Yes. It's amazing. I guess, can we talk? We haven't mentioned Willie Calhoun, but can you explain why Willie Calhoun was a particularly egregious case of misjustice? Lyons and Howell made a list of the men they said were in the orderly room that they had personally asked if they're going to travel on the truck, and that all these men, 10 men, all refused. What's interesting is Willie Calhoun wasn't even there. Hurd had given there. Hurd had given him permission to go to personnel to get his pay allotment changed or something for his family. So he was over there. He wasn't involved in any of this. He wasn't even there. Right. But he was on trial. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. So. And that was the only real success for Parsons, was he did get Willie Calhoun released for not being present for any of it. But, I mean, can we talk about what the sentences were? Yes. What page is that on? Because the sentence after the court reviewed everything, they were decreased. But the original sentences were, the court judged Calhoun not guilty. The other 9 men, however, declared guilty. The court closed again to consider sentences. When they returned, they threw the book at Hurd, sentenced him to be confined at hard labor for 20 years. They threw the book almost as hard at Sims Bridges, sentencing him to be confined at hard labor 18 years. They found Lehi Ratliff a bit less culpable and sentenced him to hard labor for 12 years. Rucker and Willie Howell moved toward the truck, so the sentencing was for 5 years. Hollingsworth, Windy, Weaver and Lindy and Falks had climbed into the truck, so their sentencing was 3 years. So
they got sentenced to 3 years hard labor, even though they complied with the order.
Right. Yes. Now, what happens with this is the case is reviewed, and I think some of those sentences were decreased, but still they went to what is called rehabilitation centers. And the name rehabilitation centers is a misnomer because you're talking about double wire fencing, dogs, guards, so forth and so on, and jail cells.
And I want to point out, because there was a lot of soldiers in World War II, and there were some bad guys, and there were some criminals, and so these guys were put in these rehabilitation centers with hardcore criminals. I mean,
And the Army hoped by naming it Rehabilitation Center that some of these would be rehabilitated and sent back into the military. Yeah, I read the histories. They moved them a lot between different camps, but there were many people that escaped. And there were people that had committed worse crimes than not getting into a truck.
Yeah. Well, I think to conclude, will you read your final paragraph from the chapter called Punishment? So on page 213.
Yes. Somebody had committed a crime. Either 9 young soldiers at Big Urso, Alaska committed mutiny, or the United States Army in Whitehorse, Yukon perpetrated a gross miscarriage of justice. But honorable men, the young black soldiers and the Army officers who punished them, did their duty as they saw it. The perpetrator who committed the crime wasn't a person. The perpetrator was the invisible hand that ruled the lives of all the colored people in the entire South. The invisible hand came to the Army with black soldiers. The Army had fed 10 young soldiers into the system of military justice to set an example. Having made its point, the Army returned them all to normal duty. But they returned to normal duty, and ultimately they left the Army to live their lives in a world still ruled by the invisible hand, regulated by the laws of Jim Crow. And I must say, the invisible hand, I am quoting Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, and she talks about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really important story that I think not enough people know about. I mean, it's just so egregious. The injustice is so incredibly egregious.
No one knows the history of these 10 men going through mutiny charges. I cannot imagine being in the courtroom with all these white soldiers, because none of the panel was black. They were all white.
Exactly. And saying out loud, without a hint of irony, that what they did was worse than Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. Yes. Making them feel as small as possible with humiliation.
It's just insane. Well, thank you so much to you.
You're welcome.
And for writing the book. And I want to ask you, Christine, can you tell us how the new book is going? I know when we talked last time, you said that you were working on a book about nurses in World War II. And I just wanted to know if you've made any progress or have any updates for us.
I'm halfway. I got him, to Bowman Field. I got him on the ship, USS Lions, and they're now heading to Africa. There are 25 nurses, and it's taken a lot of time. As you know, writing is not as easy as television tells you to write a bestseller or anything. It's just not easy with the research, but I'm still working on it. Hopefully I can get it done within the next year, hopefully.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to it. And, hopefully we can have you back on when your new book comes out.
Big thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel, also called Anchorage Life. And thank you to you, our listeners. Next week, founder and editor of the Alaska Landmine blog and host of the Alaska Landmine podcast, Jeff Landfield. Please tune in.